Price had heard about isolated people in different parts of the world that seemed to be immune to tooth decay. So Price basically looked at this and he said, okay, in America, almost all the people here have tooth decay. This is the America that Price is living in at this time. The nutrition is at the bottom, the health is at the bottom, and everyone's got tooth decay. And so Price says, how do I find populations that are controls? He's thinking about this like a scientist. He's saying, what do I compare the tooth decay to? How do I get good scientific controls? And so when he hears that there are these populations scattered around the world who have not really come into contact with modern society, who are free of tooth decay, he says, aha, these are my controls. And that brings us to the point where he sets foot off the continent. And well, I shouldn't say off the continent because some of his investigations were in North America, of course, but this is when he begins his travels.
Welcome to the Wise Traditions Podcast, sponsored by the Weston A. Price Foundation for wise traditions in food, farming, and the healing arts. We're your source for scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom to help you achieve optimal health.
Hey everybody, I'm Hilda Labrada Gore and this is episode 155. My guest today is Chris Masterjohn. Chris earned his PhD in Nutritional Sciences from the University of Connecticut. He is a health educator and expert, and a fellow podcaster with a show called Mastering Nutrition. We invited Chris to talk with us about the work of Weston A. Price today, because he knows it like the back of his hand, and not many do. He has been called the Isaac Newton of nutrition, and I'm talking about Dr. Price, not Chris right now. Because Dr. Price's work is so foundational for our understanding of good health today. What did he do? In the 1930s, he traveled around the world. He set out to find the healthiest people, to discover what they were eating and what they were doing that would maintain the good health of their teeth and their bodies. He noticed patterns in their diets that promoted good health, vitality, and fertility that we can apply to our lives today. Chris breaks it all down for us, including giving us specific tips for what foods we should avoid and those we should include in our diet based on Dr. Price's findings, so that we too can enjoy the good health that we seek. But first, we want to just do a quick thanks to our sponsors, Ancestral Supplements, putting back in what the modern world has left out. New Zealand-sourced liver, organ meats, and bone marrow in convenient gelatin capsules. Order yours today at ancestralsupplements.com. And of course, this show is a project of the Weston A. Price Foundation. Are you wondering where to start when it comes to healthy eating? Get the basics on the Wise Traditions diet. The Weston A. Price Foundation has come up with a primer of sorts. It's 7 easy lessons on how to eat a nourishing diet. The great part, the lessons are available for free. Just go to our website, westonaprice.org, and click on the green button that says Get the Basics of the Wise Traditions Diet. Sign up and they'll come straight to your inbox free of charge. It's that easy. This is Holistic Hilda, and you're listening to Wise Traditions. Welcome to Wise Traditions, Chris.
It's amazing to be here. Thank you so much, Hilda.
Well, speaking of amazing, you just got back from some amazing travels. I understand you were in Greece, and it kind of harkens to what we're going to talk about today, because we are going to dig deep and talk about who Dr. Weston A. Price was and what he learned on his travels around the world. Now, I think you were trying to reconnect with your ancestry, but Dr. Price had another question he was trying to solve. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
About my question or about Price's?
Well, let's go with both.
Well, in my case, in my travels, I guess there's a little bit of Price's spirit. I've just wanted to travel a lot for a long time. So Price had a scientific question that motivated his travels. I decided to go to Greece both to kind of rediscover my spiritual roots and also to see if I had any long-lost relatives on the island of Nisyros. And so I kind of made 2 themes to my travels. One was to visit churches and monasteries and venerate some of the tombs of my favorite saints, and the other was to travel to the little tiny island of Nisyros to see, if not knowing anyone, to see if I had any long-lost relatives. And that was that latter part was very successful. And I discovered 2 of my grandfather's first cousins, 5 of my mother's second cousins, 6 of my own third cousins. And then they accepted me as family. They were moved that I came looking for them, and I just spent all my time there with them. I canceled a lot of other plans of my trip so I could stay on the island longer, and I do hope to go back next year. Price, there's a little bit of a spirit of Price's exploration. I did pay attention to food when I was there. But of course, Price is another story that's very much a scientific question that motivated his travels.
And what was that question, Chris? What was he trying to go after?
So before Price ever stepped off the continent, and of course we're talking now back in the 1920s and 30s, even going back a little before the 1920s, for basically 25 years leading up to when he first stepped off the continent, his goal was simply to investigate the causes and consequences of tooth decay. And he had become the first research director of what eventually became the American Dental Association. And, before that, he was a dentist. So he basically took his dental expertise as a clinician. He also had a research background in a more general sense. So he fused these 2 expertises together and did an enormous amount of laboratory and clinical research into what causes tooth decay and then what are the consequences of tooth decay. And his research was pointing in the direction that tooth decay was caused by an absence of protective factors. He just didn't know what they were. So what he knew was, in animal experiments, for example, he could take any of the supposed causes of tooth decay, like a starchy diet or certain bacteria that we know can erode enamel, whatever it was. If you tried to introduce it into the animal, if the animal was healthy, it just didn't really convincingly cause tooth decay. And when he looked at people, what he saw was that the people who had a lot of tooth decay had a certain characteristic of their saliva that was different from the people who didn't have tooth decay. So in the people who had tooth decay, if he isolated their saliva and he mixed it up with powdered bone, the minerals would move from the powdered bone into the saliva. But when he took saliva from people who did not have tooth decay and did the same thing, the minerals would move in the opposite direction. They would move from the saliva to the powdered bone. So he's looking at this and he's saying, this isn't just about the things that are eroding the enamel and finding their way into the dentin underneath the enamel and actually making the cavity. There's something physiologically different about these people that's influencing their saliva and how their saliva behaves when it's taken out of their mouth and there's no teeth there. And so Price wanted to figure out, what is this physiological difference between the people who do and don't have tooth decay? What are these protective factors that the healthy animals seem to have that make them immune to tooth decay? And this question of, I know there's some kind of naturally protective factor, but I don't know what it is what motivated Price to step off the continent in the first place. Because Price had heard about, through the anthropological investigations that were going on at the time, about isolated people in different parts of the world that seemed to be immune to tooth decay. So Price basically looked at this and he said, okay, in America, almost all the people here have tooth decay. And, at the time Price is doing this research, probably the health of Americans was at one of the all-time low points, because the context here is that we had recently decided how to refine foods, but we didn't know that it had any negative health consequences because we didn't know about the vitamins yet. So, Price's work is kind of working alongside the vitamins getting discovered one by one while Price is doing his work. And so he's working in the context of, and of course, also during Price's work, we had the Great Depression happen. So the economy also hurts the diets. But I think the real bad thing at this time was we were like, hey, we can make bread taste better by refining it. We can give it a longer shelf life. We can make it softer and fluffier. But we had no idea that we were taking all the nutrition out of it.
Right.
And so we neither decided to fortify the bread with some of the nutrients that we're missing, nor had we decided to tell people that you need to eat more than bread, right? So there's two big things that are missing, which is there's no education about what a balanced diet is. There's not really like a nutritional science that has any recommendations about what to eat. And there's no sense that there's something deeply wrong with this bread. And so there's no particular reason for people not to just eat most of their diet as coffee, white sugar, and white bread. And when the Great Depression happens, then there's economic motivation to actually eat a diet like that, because some of the cheapest foods you can get are white sugar and white bread, right? So my grandmother during the Great Depression, a typical snack for her was like white bread topped with lard, probably from confined pigs, and white sugar, right? So it's not a balanced diet at all. This is the America that Price is living in at this time. The nutrition is at the bottom, the health is at the bottom, and everyone's got tooth decay. And so Price says, how do I find populations that are controls? He's thinking about this like a scientist. He's saying, what do I compare the tooth decay to? How do I get good scientific controls? And so when he hears that there are these populations scattered around the world who have not really come into contact with modern society, who are free of tooth decay, he says, aha, these are my controls. And that brings us to the point where he sets foot off the continent and goes to well, I shouldn't say off the continent, because some of his investigations were in North America, of course, but this is when he begins his travels.
Wow, and it's amazing to me that he did, as you said, he merged those expertises, and then he took that leap to leave the country, and it wasn't easy back then. He took his wife with him, and I think it took him like 10 years, and he visited at least 14 countries. So what did he learn, Chris? What did he learn from those traditional peoples that were the control group, so to speak?
Well, he in fact got even better scientific control than I think he was first looking for. He was able to find many of these populations where he could find the populations who were isolated and eating their traditional diets and directly compare them to people from the same genetic stock, from the same altitude and latitude, from the same environment, but who might have been a few miles away in a port town where what he called the displacing foods of modern commerce had started coming in: white flour, white sugar, canned goods, syrups, sugars, and so on. And so he was actually, he had a situation that was much better than simply comparing Americans to them as controls. He, in most cases, was directly comparing within this genetic stock, for example, within the Swiss Valley, within the groups in Africa, within the Pacific Islands. What do you see when you compare the isolated versus modernized groups? And beyond that, he was often able to make observations within a family where the parents had started to eat the modern refined foods after they had some of their children. So he could look at what was the difference in development of the children who either were raised on modern refined foods versus the traditional foods, or who simply were in utero, in the mother's womb, at the time that she was eating refined foods versus traditional foods. And so basically what he found within his own expertise, where he had absolutely tremendous data, was that in the first generation of eating refined foods, you see the onset of tooth decay. And we're talking tooth decay rates very close to zero with the traditional foods.
Mm-hmm.
And tooth decay rates, depending on the population, that might have been a few percent of the teeth in some cases, or might have been most of the teeth in other cases, depending partly, I think, on the background genetics and also partly on just how bad the diet had gotten. But in the first generation, you take someone who grew up on the traditional foods, and when they were an adult or when they were in their late teens started eating the modern refined foods, what you see is the onset of rampant tooth decay. What you see in the second generation, where those people were in utero in the mother when she was eating those foods, and they were raised in their early development eating those modern foods, then you start to see a narrowing of the face, especially the middle third of the face and also the bottom third of the face. And so one of the things that was striking about Price's research is, until I had read Nutrition and Physical Degeneration, I always thought of the width of the face as primarily a genetic thing. You look at people with some ancestry and you see narrower faces. You look at people with other ancestry, you see wider faces. Price was basically finding that no matter where your ancestry came from, a face that was at least wide enough to fit all of your teeth without crowding, and at least wide enough to make plenty of room for your nostrils to have no discomfort breathing through your nose, was the baseline default of how wide anyone's face should be. And when you have a face narrower than that, which you can see visibly, but of course you can also feel, right? Because if the middle third of your face is narrower, it is harder to breathe through your nose all the time. And when your jaw is too narrow to fit all your teeth get crowded and you need braces and so on. And so these things Price was finding were primarily nutritional. And then on top of all this, outside of his primary expertise, he also had a lot of opportunities to talk to doctors in those regions who might have been treating the isolated traditionally living peoples, and in many cases had access both to the isolated traditionally living peoples and people who were eating modern diets. And what he found was that the same vulnerability to the tooth decay and dental deformities correlated with and corresponded to a vulnerability to many other types of diseases. And so he named his book that he wrote at the end of these travels, he named it Nutrition and Physical Degeneration, not Nutrition and Tooth Decay or Nutrition and Dental Deformities, because the primary conclusion was that degenerative diseases in general people were made vulnerable to all of the degenerative diseases of modern society by the same kind of refined foods and lack of nutrition that underlied their vulnerability to tooth decay and dental deformities.
Coming up, Chris touches on Dr. Price's 4 basic categories of a thriving traditional diet.
You're listening to the Wise Traditions Podcast, sponsored by the Weston A. Price Foundation. We pause now to recognize our sponsors.
Ancestral supplements. Ancestral supplements offer New Zealand-sourced bone marrow and nose-to-tail organ meats like liver, heart, kidney, pancreas, spleen, and more in simple, convenient gelatin capsules. Traditional peoples and early ancestral healers believed that eating the organs from a healthy animal would strengthen and support the health of the corresponding organ of the individual. In other words, a person with a weak heart was fed the heart of a healthy animal, and so on. I personally know I don't get enough organ meats in my diet, so I went ahead and got some supplements for myself. Visit ancestralsupplements.com today to see what they can do for you. Ancestral Supplements, putting back in what the modern world has left out. And the Weston A. Price Foundation invites you to join us in Baltimore, Maryland, November 16th to the 19th for our annual Wise Traditions Conference. Chris will be there along with other prominent speakers and me, so join us. We'll connect with each other, eat good food, and learn all kinds of stuff. How to nourish through traditional foods, how to farm, cook, self-heal, treat, and even prevent the flu, starve cancer, detox, and more. So sign up today at wisetraditions.org and use the coupon code PODCAST for a discounted registration price. See you there. That is such a critical conclusion for us to hear today. And I'm so glad this book has had a resurgence of popularity, or if it hasn't, I think it should, because it's not about just this dentist who went around the world in the 1930s and noticed that people who changed their diet had more tooth decay. You're right, it had to do with the whole of their health. Hey, and Chris, do you remember the story of the skulls that Dr. Price found on the coast of Peru?
Tell the story.
I was hoping you would ask. No, but seriously, let me just say, when I was in Peru with my friend Katita Williamson, she said to me, Hilda, look at this chapter in Dr. Price's book. And it was about how, you see, at that time, graves were being ransacked, and there were all these skulls scattered on the coast of Lima. And Dr. Price examined them, and being the researcher that he was, made careful note of the condition of the skulls and the jaws and the teeth and all this. And what he saw was that in over 1,700 skulls, there wasn't one dental deformity or crowding of the teeth. So this is a great indicator, especially to those who say, well, it's just genetic. Some people just have narrow faces and crowded teeth. That's just how it is. No, our genetic birthright, our potential is to have all of the teeth fitting properly. So Dr. Price saw that on the coast of Peru, and that's what we're all shooting for today, to get back to that place of health, because that's what good health looks like.
No, I agree. This is definitely the central finding of Price's work, and replicated both, as you noted, in the archaeological record, in the living people that Price studied, and then in his own patients. Because at the conclusion of his travels, the story doesn't end there. He comes back and tries to replicate these findings in his own patients. And so he says, okay, you have crowded teeth, you have tooth decay. What can we do by changing your diet? And the crowded teeth, you can't really do anything about if you're an adult. Your jaw is pretty much going to be the shape that it is, minus what we do in modern dentistry to align the teeth. But when you start from the beginning, so you start with the prenatal nutrition of the mother, that's when you really can take a parental pair who are producing children with crowded teeth, and you can fix their nutrition, and they will start producing children without crowded teeth, and vulnerability to tooth decay as well. But he showed this by taking mothers who had one son with crowded teeth, and then intervened with the diet and changed it, and showed its efficacy. And then I think one of the most amazing things that he showed actually in his patient population was that you could actually reverse active tooth decay with diet. And I think this is extremely underappreciated to this day. I think people think that the only thing you can do once you have a cavity is get it filled. But in fact, Price was completely healing cavities simply by changing people's diet. And he replicated this over and over again in dozens of patients. And Price was not the only one to show this. Sir Edward Mellanby, who's credited with discovering vitamin D, he also had shown with a very similar dietary intervention that you can take active tooth decay, just change the diet, and cause the tooth to heal itself. And this was actually something that Price, he knew about the phenomenon before he started his travels, because one of the things that he found when he was doing laboratory and clinical research before his travels was that women often had evidence of cavities that had started when they were pregnant and had spontaneously healed after pregnancy. Wow. And the logic there, of course, is that your nutritional needs are a lot higher when you're pregnant, because you're not just eating for yourself, you're eating to produce a new being. And so if your nutrition is marginal, if your normal diet is like just barely preventing tooth decay with the minerals and fat soluble vitamins and so on, then when you become pregnant, all of a sudden your diet isn't good enough anymore, because now you have this number one priority to nourish the development of the embryo and fetus, and that can come at the expense of nourishing your bones and teeth. But then you give birth to the baby after a certain time passes, you keep eating the same diet, then maybe if it was marginal, it would be good enough to heal those cavities. But of course, if the diet is not good enough, then maybe you don't have to get pregnant to get those cavities. And maybe no matter what your status is, pregnant or not, you're not going to be able to heal them. And so I think that was the thing that he was able to bring home with him after his travels, having already known about the phenomenon of rehealing cavities, was how do you make it happen? You make it happen by enriching the diet in all the nutrients, but especially the ones that he put the most emphasis on were the fat-soluble vitamins and the minerals.
So let's help people get there too. How do we make it happen today, right where we are?
Well, I think you can approach this from a few different levels. So at the very baseline, you just want to follow general good practices of nutrition. And I think we have to look at Price's work, and we also have to look at what are all the things that we've discovered about nutrition since then. So if you look at Price's work, one of the key conclusions that you come away with about what makes a good diet is he identified 4 classes of foods that were very important as sources of fat-soluble vitamins. And Price put emphasis on fat-soluble vitamins not because they are more important than water-soluble vitamins to have, but because they're harder to get, and they were more often limiting factors that people had to go out of their way to procure. If you look at something like vitamin A, for example, you can get vitamin A from precursors in red, orange, yellow, and green plant foods. In animal foods, you can get the actual form that we need in our body, known as retinol, from liver and eyeballs. So it's very limited in its distribution. I mean, you can easily eat a vitamin A deficient diet if even if you're including the plant form, even if you're including the carotenoids, which are the precursors in plant foods. It's fairly easy to, if you don't know about that, it's fairly easy to put together a diet that doesn't have many carotenoids in it. I mean, just eat a lot of bread or eat a lot of corn, any of the grains, potatoes, like there's all kinds of things that are very good at supplying your calories and don't provide those carotenoids. So to get those, you need to emphasize red, orange, yellow, and green vegetables. But a lot of us, for genetics or health reasons, aren't good at converting the carotenoids to the form of vitamin A that we actually need, which is retinol. And retinol, it occurs in a little bit in butter, a little bit in egg yolks, but the only gold mine really of retinol is the liver of an animal. If you're after that retinol, you have to eat the liver of the animal. That's like you have to have some kind of wisdom or knowledge base to know you kill the animal, you must harvest the liver, and you must eat the liver, because without that knowledge and without going out of your way to get it, it would be fairly easy to become deficient in it. Mm-hmm. So all the 4 fat-soluble vitamins, A, D, E, and K, are kind of like that. And Price put emphasis on the fat-soluble vitamins because they were so hard to get. And he outlined 4 categories of foods that at least one category was present in each traditional diet. And so one category he listed as dairy products, which would include the dairy fat, which actually is where all the fat-soluble vitamins are. Another one was egg yolks and organ meats. He put those together. And then a third was the animal life of the sea, so the fish and shellfish. And of course, oftentimes, or most of the time, to eat fish didn't mean a fillet of the muscle meat. It meant the whole fish. You eat the fish heads, the fish liver, and so on. So that's another case of organ meats, actually. And then the 4th category he outlined was small animals such as frogs and insects. And again, these small animals are mostly eaten whole, and so it's quite easy to just eat the whole animal there. And so each group did not eat from all these categories, but they all ate at least one and possibly more than that. And they put special emphasis on the need to procure those foods. So we can say from Price's work that we need to have at least one of those categories. And for most of us, that's going to be, certainly egg yolks are easy for most of us to include in our diet. Dairy products, some of us can't tolerate dairy products, but many of us can, and that's a very easy one to work into the diet. A lot of people in the Weston A. Price world, a lot of people eat liver. It's not anywhere near as common to eat liver or take cod liver oil as it used to be. But if you know about this, then that's something you can do. A good habit to make is to eat liver once or twice a week. Or if you really can't stomach liver, at least take cod liver oil on a daily basis. That's one way of partially compensating for what you could get from liver. Certainly shellfish are easy for many of us to include. Some of us have religious restrictions. Some of us have poor digestive systems that might exclude shellfish. But if you can eat shellfish, then eating a diversity of shellfish is a great thing. Most of us are not going to eat many insects or small frogs. It is becoming more and more popular to use cricket flour and protein bars made from cricket flour. That's a thing now. But for the most part, most of us just culturally, we're not eating insects. So if we can work in liver once or twice a week, and we can work in shellfish, and we can work in cod liver oil, and we can work in egg yolks and dairy, I think that's, for most of us, those are going to be the big things we're going to do to put that emphasis on the fat soluble vitamins. And then Price also, of course, put an enormous emphasis on not consuming what he called the displacing foods of modern commerce. Right. So one basic thing that we can do is just make sure that most of our food is not white bread. Most of our food is not white sugar. Most of our food is not the syrups and canned goods. And, if we cut out most of the white things, the refined things, then that puts us in a very good position.
Well, you've given us a great overview of those 4 categories of foods, but I know I have more questions. I'm sure the listeners do too. So I'm hoping we can do a part 2, because I want to find out from you how we can really measure our nutritional intake and manage it, or I guess I should say maximize it, so that we can get that optimal health that is our birthright. Would you be cool with doing a part 2, Chris? Are you good with that?
That's fine. Yeah.
Awesome. So I want to wrap up now by asking you, if the listener could do one thing to improve their health, what would you recommend that they do?
I think that's highly individual. So I think that the best thing that anyone can do is take a step back and kind of get away from all the noise of all their usual routines, and take a break from everything and take a look at what they're doing in their life. I think a lot of us run on autopilot. So if we just take some time to evaluate our habits and lifestyle and figure out what are the things that are really helping us with our goals, and what might be the things that aren't helping us with our goals or might actually be negative contributors, I think having a little bit of distance from our usual habits and routines can help a lot to evaluate that. And hey, having just come back from a month-long trip, I would say that one of the best things that you can do to facilitate that is to actually step out of your usual routine entirely. So if you can take a trip somewhere and just shut your brain off and do something completely different for a few days or a week, that can be a really powerful way to de-stress, but it can also be something that can help you come back with a fresh mind and, suddenly see what those things are that, might usually feel a bit like you're a fish in the water, where you can't really see what those habits are and what's good and bad and what's getting you to your goals and what's not. But if you have a little distance, sometimes you can come back with a fresh eye to those things and come back with a fresher and newer start.
Wow, that sounds refreshing and powerful. So thank you so much for those words and for being on the show today. My guest today was Chris Masterjohn. For more on Chris, visit his website, chrismasterjohnphd.com. You can find the show notes for today's episode on the westonaprice.org website. And on that same podcast page, you'll see our listener survey. Please take just a moment to fill it out. We want to get to know you better. And thank you. Finally, subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app so you don't miss a thing. Also, a quick thank you to our faithful team of podcast interns. We could not pull off this show without them. Post-production assistants include Cassie Reeve, Diva Rizvi, Melanie Ahern, and Ari O'Hara. Cheryl Heftelin helps with social media. Mary Hine, Olga de Villiers, and Joy de los Santos boost sponsorship and help with special projects. Our listening team includes Heather Carpentier and Victor Coseto. Amy Matias helps with transcriptions. And music is from Michelle Bloom's CD Big Backyard, specifically the track Sunny Side Up. Find out more about her music at allthingsbloom.com. And that's it. So let's keep in touch, everybody. I'm on Instagram at holistic_Hilda. Follow me for health tips, podcast stuff, and behind the scenes on the show and me. That's it, and see you soon.
Thanks for listening today. We have all kinds of resources to support you on your health journey. On the Weston A. Price Foundation website, you'll find podcasts, blogs, articles, and brochures related to just about any health topic you can imagine. You can also find a local chapter to help you discover sources of real, organic food in your area. And you can become a member to support the Foundation's mission of education, research, and activism. Visit westonaprice.org for all this and more. And remember that the Wise Traditions podcast is available on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Wise Traditions is a project of the Weston A. Price Foundation for wise traditions in food, farming, and the healing arts. The content on this podcast is provided for informational purposes only and is not intended to substitute for the advice provided by your doctor or healthcare professional. It is not intended to be, nor does it constitute healthcare or medical advice.